Welcome. We're going to begin with the introduction to psychology, and really what we're going to do here at the beginning is just look at what is psychology, how does it differ from common sense, is there a difference between psychology and common sense? Well, we're going to explore that. Psychology is a science, looking at research methodology, and to determine how it works as a science. Let's get started, and I hope you enjoy this semester. How much do you know about psychology? Now, the point I'm going to make is that psychology is a science, but not common sense. So, go through these and answer these questions true or false. And at the end of the video, I'm going to give you the results, and you can just sort of see for yourself how well you've done. You know you can pause the video to do this, so feel free, pause the video, and then let's carry on. Let's start by defining psychology. When we define psychology, we can consider this as a study of behavior and mental process. And this would be a scientific study. And we're going to go through what does it mean for it to be a scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So what we'll do as a way of introducing you is just to look at what the scientific method is. And when we look at the scientific method, it's the orderly and systematic procedures that researchers follow, and they begin with identifying the research problem, and there's a lot to be done with it. We're going to go through this in a little bit further in this video. Secondly, they design a study to investigate the problem, and it's not as straightforward as getting an idea how to do a research and then going ahead and doing it. There's a lot more to it. Thirdly, they collect the data and they analyze the data. They statistically analyze it, and through the investigation of the research and through the data, they must control for bias. And then fourthly, they draw conclusions, and then fifthly, they communicate their findings, share them so others can replicate and verify their research to see that it actually has the kind of foundation and supports that it needs. And so that's basically, you know, in a very, very tight nutshell, what's involved with the definition and how it is a scientific. Now, we're going to go into more detail. Well, let's look at the goals of psychology. And we're going to look at a few here. There's going to be 4. Description is one of the goals. It tells, it tells us what occurred, the behavioral or mental processes, as accurately and as completely as possible. Usually it's a good starting point when pursuing a new field to study. The second goal is that of explanation, an understanding of conditions of the behavior and mental processes, confirmed by ruling in or out of alternatives, causes and effect, and under what circumstances things occur. The third goal is that of prediction. Identifying the condition under which behavior or mental processes occur. They can then begin to predict when or under what circumstances something is likely to occur. And then fourthly is that of influence. Applying principles prevents unwanted occurrences or about bringing out desired outcomes. So when we think in terms of a theory, what is a theory? A theory is a general principle or a set of principles proposed to explain how a number of separate facts are related. Now, we're going to go through a number of different theories, and I would like you to consider it like a pair of sunglasses, and each pair of sunglasses have a different color. Each theory will look at a set of separate facts, human behavior or mental processes, and we'll view it from a slightly different point of view. Now, whether that's from a theoretical point of view or whether that's from a set of standards, but each point of view will be looking at the same structures, the same behavior, the same mental process, but might have a different take or a different spin or a different view of how to explain it. And that's what a theory is. It's a general principle or a set of principles proposed to explain a number of separate facts that are related. Now, what's important about a theory and the strength and the ability to strengthen a theory is known as replication. And this is the process of repeating a study with different participants and preferably different investigators to verify the research findings. So you want to be able to replicate things and get a similar result. This relates to validity and reliability. The more replication, the more the similar results by different people and under different circumstances, the stronger the theory. Basic versus applied research. Now this is kind of interesting because you've probably had some experience in both. Basic research is conducted to seek out new knowledge and explore and advance general scientific understanding. It hasn't got a specific purpose, whereas applied research is conducted specifically to solve practical problems and improve the quality of life. So when we're looking at descriptive research, there's a number of ways that we can go with this. One is through naturalistic observation. This is where researchers observe and record behavior of people or animals, for that matter, when it comes to animal research, in their natural setting without influencing or without controlling that behavior. It's not as easy as it sounds. It requires a set of skills in order to do that and to hold back what you would understand to be your biases. Now, that's not the only method. There's also laboratory observations, and this is where behavior is studied in a laboratory type setting, allowing for more control and the use of precise instruments. And again, this isn't as straightforward. It takes a lot of training to learn how to implement the observations in a particular controlled and precise way of using measurements and instruments to gather the data. Now again, these aren't the only two. Case studies. Now, case studies are intense bits of research of a single person or a small number of individuals that are studied in great depth. The Three Faces of Eve is a book that was written regarding a case study done of a woman with multiple personalities. So it was an intense and in great depth about her history and about her circumstances, and that would be considered a case study. Now, you can also look at survey research. These are where interviews or questionnaires are used to gather information about attitudes, beliefs, experiences, or behaviors of a group of people. Now, chances are you've been asked at some point in your life to fill out a research survey and answer specific questions. And if you've done research-based surveys, you will have found out that you can't change the question. The question is asked the way it is asked in a standardized manner, and you just have to answer either yes or no or offer some explanation. Now, when we consider these different descriptive research methods, we also have to consider who are we gathering information about. So we look at a population. Now, a population is an entire group of interest to the researchers to which they wish to generalize their findings. So there's a huge population, but then we want to gather a sample, part of the population that is studied in order to reach conclusions about the entire population. So we don't have to survey or observe the entire population, we just need to get a sample. And then there's what's called a representative sample. The sample that mirrors the population of interest. This includes subgroups and in some proportion, in the same proportion as found in the population. Okay? All right, so now let's move into a particular area that doesn't always get a lot of attention, but it's a very good means of which research methods are being done. It's called the correlational method. Correlational research looks to explain phenomena by looking at other factors that occur alongside the phenomena. It expresses a relationship between variables, but it does not show causation. So it does not look at cause and effect. It just says that these two things occur at the same time. So why do students drop out of school? What factors might influence this decision? There isn't a single cause and effect about that, but there may be correlational things that occur simultaneously that might explain why students drop out of school. And so, for example, the correlation describes the strength of relationship between two or more variables. In other words, it explains how likely it is that you will find two variables together. Student dropout rates and feelings of isolation are highly correlated. So when students feel isolated, there's a greater risk of dropping out. These are a couple of other examples. You know, as more ice cream is eaten, more people are murdered. Does that mean that ice cream causes murder, or does murder cause people to eat ice cream? It's not cause and effect. Now, what we can also consider when we look at the use of correlational coefficient is to identify how strongly the links of the variables are. Now, they can be positively correlated, they can be negatively correlated, or they may have what is known as a no correlation. And so we use a correlation coefficient to identify how strongly they're linked. It ranges from a +1 to 0 to a -1. And this means the variables can be either positively, negatively, or there be no correlation in terms of the social facts or the behaviors that are being studied. Let's look at the steps in the experimental method. The experimental method, now, the only research method to identify cause and effect relationship between two or more variables or conditions. Now we're going to look at some definition pieces here. There's beginning with a hypothesis. This is a prediction about cause and effect relationship between two or more variables. It's not having to be right. It just is what you're aiming your research for is the hypothesis. So let's break this down a little further with some more definitions. When we look at variables, it's any condition or factors that can be manipulated, controlled, or measured. Now, the independent variable, this is the factor or condition that is deliberately manipulated to determine whether it causes change in another behavior or condition. Researchers deliberately manipulate the independent variable and they test it against the dependent variable. Any condition or factor that can be manipulated, controlled, or measured, it's measured at the end of the experiment. So for example, if you're trying to measure whether meditation reduces stress, well, the meditation would be the manipulated factor, so that's the independent variable. Whether it reduces stress, well, you need to have some way of measuring that, but that would be the dependent variable. So as you add meditation, does it change a person's effect on stress? So the independent variable is the treatment, if you will. The dependent variable is what you look to see if there's any change in, and that's how we look at that. Now, if we consider, and you'll hear this referenced a bit throughout the course, will be the experimental group versus the control group. The experimental group is the group that's exposed to the independent variable. These would be the people in the experimental group who will be learning how to meditate to see if it affects their level of stress. Now, the control group, on the other hand, this is a group of similar to the experimental group, but they're exposed to the same experimental environment, but they're not given the independent variable. They're not given meditation, and then it's used as a comparison to see if whether the experimental group or the meditation does or does not have an effect on stress of the similar group, sample group, representative sample from a similar population. Now, I've mentioned about bias, and there are sources of bias in research, and research wants to control bias. We don't want any bias involved. And so when we look at the different sort of way of sources of bias, well, one is selection bias. Selecting participants and assigning participants to experimental or control groups at the beginning of an experiment that will predictably affect the outcome in the experiment. You don't want to do that. You want to be able to select your population, your participants, without bias. You don't want to select what you know will have an impact on your independent variable. That wouldn't be fair. That's not unbiased. So one way we correct for that is to have what's called a random assignment. Participants in the experimental and control groups are selected by chance procedure. Everyone has an equal chance to be in either group. This is a control for selection bias. Now, there is also another technique that's known as the placebo effect. When participants expectations influence the outcome rather than the independent variable. If I tell you that eating ice cream is going to lower your stress, even though it really wouldn't, or take this miracle cure, it's going to lower your stress, and if that miracle cure is really just a sugar pill, it's not going to have any impact. But if you believe it will, then that affects the research as well, and we have to protect against that. Also, we have to protect against experimenter bias. When the experimenter preconceived ideas influence the outcome. And we have to protect against having any degree of bias. We want to see the behavior or the mental process on its own stand on its own. So one of the big ways by which to protect against that is what's known as a double-blind procedure. A control for these biases. Here, the participants and the experimenters both don't know, they are unaware of who was in the experimental group and who was in the control group. And that protects against most forms of bias. Lastly, and not least important, is protecting research participant rights. Now, there's a number of things that need to be in consideration here. One is the legality. You cannot ask participants to do illegal things. There are legal considerations when putting out doing research, particularly when you start to put participants at some degree of risk. In hospital settings and institutional settings, institutional approval, ethics and morality needs to be considered and needs to be acceptable. Informed consent. Participants need to be voluntary, and they should be able to withdraw at any time. Now, deception. Only when the participant's awareness will be affecting the outcome, you need to be conscious of the role of deception. And then finally, debriefing. You must divulge the true purpose and rationale of the experiment to all participants. Usually debriefing is done at the end of the experiments. Okay, there we go. Oh yes, your survey at the beginning as to whether or not science or common sense for psychology. In those questions, all the even are true and all the odd are false. Check and see how you did. All right then, there we go. First part, first video done. Let's enjoy the rest of the semester and carry on the good work. Bye now.